You should know what happened this 1841 and why it is the most important event in history. The murder of Mary Rogers, the beautiful cigar girl in New York City, inspired Edgar Allan Poe's story. Despite investigations, the killer was never found. Please let us know in the comments where you are watching this history video and what time you are watching it. And be sure to subscribe to the channel for future videos. Welcome, history enthusiasts, to this deep dive into one of the most enigmatic and captivating mysteries of the 19th century. Imagine a bustling New York City in the early 1840s, a metropolis on the cusp of explosive growth, where horse-drawn carriages clattered over cobblestone streets, gas lamps flickered to life at dusk, and the air was thick with the scents of coal smoke, fresh baked bread from corner vendors, and the salty tang of the nearby harbors. This was a time when the city was shedding its colonial skin and emerging as a vibrant, chaotic hub of commerce, immigration, and intrigue. Amid this whirlwind of progress and peril lived a young woman whose life and untimely death would capture the imagination of a nation, spark a media sensation unlike any before it, and even inspire the literary genius of Edgar Allan Poe to craft what many consider a cornerstone of detective fiction. Our story centers on Mary Cecilia Rogers, a name that might not ring immediate bells today, but in 1841 echoed through every tavern, newspaper office, and drawing room from Manhattan to the farthest reaches of the young United States. Born around 1820 in Lyme, Connecticut, though exact records of her birth have frustratingly eluded historians, Mary was the daughter of a modest family. Her father, a steamboat captain, met an early demise in a tragic boiler explosion when Mary was just a child, leaving her mother, Phoebe Rogers, to raise her alone. Phoebe, a resilient widow, relocated the family to New York City, seeking better opportunities in the throbbing heart of American ambition. They settled into a boarding house on Nassau Street, a thoroughfare teeming with printers, booksellers, and the early stirrings of what would become the city's legendary publishing industry. Mary grew into a striking young woman, described by contemporaries as possessing an almost ethereal beauty. Her features were delicate yet captivating, dark, expressive eyes that seemed to hold secrets, raven hair that cascaded in soft waves, a complexion as fair as porcelain, and a smile that could disarm even the most hardened New Yorker. But it wasn't just her looks that made her famous. It was her poise, her wit, and her ability to engage with people from all walks of life. In a city where women of her class often toiled in obscurity as seamstresses or domestic servants, Mary found a path that thrust her into the public eye, one that would both elevate her and, tragically, contribute to her downfall. Enter John Anderson's Tobacco Emporium, a popular cigar shop located at 319 Broadway, right in the thick of New York's commercial district. Anderson, a shrewd businessman with an eye for marketing, hired Mary in 1838, when she was about 18 years old, to work behind the counter. This was no ordinary job, in an era when tobacco shops were male-dominated havens for gossip, politics, and leisure. Placing a beautiful young woman at the front was a stroke of genius. Mary quickly became known as the beautiful Cigar Girl, a moniker that spread like wildfire through the city's newspapers and word-of-mouth networks. Patrons flocked to the shop not just for fine cigars imported from Havana or Virginia tobacco, but to catch a glimpse of Mary, to exchange pleasantries, perhaps even to flirt under the guise of commerce. The shop itself was a microcosm of 1840s New York society. Dimly lit by oil lamps, its shelves lined with jars of aromatic tobacco leaves, boxes of hand-rolled cigars, and paraphernalia like pipes and snuff boxes, it attracted a diverse clientele: wealthy merchants in top hats and tailcoats, aspiring writers scribbling notes on scraps of paper, politicians hashing out deals over a smoke, and even the occasional celebrity of the day. Edgar Allan Poe himself, then a struggling author and editor living in the city, is believed to have visited the Emporium, drawn perhaps by the same allure that captivated so many. Poe, with his brooding intellect and fascination with the macabre, might have seen in Mary a muse waiting to unfold, though neither could have foreseen the dark twist their paths would take. Mary's role at the counter was more than mere salesmanship. she became a symbol of the era's shifting social norms. Women were beginning to enter the workforce in greater numbers, but it was still a novelty, especially in such a public-facing position. Her presence sparked debates in the press about propriety, morality, and the dangers facing young women in the urban jungle. Some lauded her as a model of independence, others whispered that her beauty invited trouble. Newspapers like the New York Herald, under the sensationalist editor James Gordon Bennett, began featuring stories about her, turning her into a local celebrity. Bennett, a pioneer of tabloid journalism, understood the power of human interest stories to sell papers, and Mary's charm provided ample fodder. But fame, as we know, often comes with shadows. Mary's first brush with notoriety and mystery came not from her job, but from a puzzling disappearance in October 1838. On the morning of October 4, Mary left the boarding house, telling her mother she was off to run errands or perhaps visit a relative. Hours turned into days, and when she failed to return, panic set in. Phoebe Rogers alerted the authorities, and soon the city was abuzz with rumors. Had she eloped, been abducted, met with foul play in the treacherous streets where pickpockets and gangs roamed? The newspapers pounced, printing lurid headlines and speculating wildly. A suicide note, purportedly from Mary, surfaced, claiming she had drowned herself in the Hudson River out of despair, though its authenticity was immediately questioned. For a week, New York held its breath. Search parties combed the docks and alleys, and rewards were offered. Then, as suddenly as she vanished, Mary reappeared, alive and well, claiming she had simply been visiting family in upstate New York. The explanation was thin, and skeptics abounded. Some theorized it was a publicity stunt orchestrated by John Anderson to boost business at the cigar shop. After all, sales reportedly skyrocketed upon her return, with curious onlookers crowding the emporium to see the resurrected beauty. Others whispered of a romantic entanglement gone awry, perhaps a secret lover who spirited her away. Mary herself remained tight-lipped, offering little beyond her initial story, which only fueled the intrigue. This incident marked Mary as more than just a pretty face. She was now a figure of mystery, a living enigma in a city hungry for scandal. Her return to the cigar shop was triumphant, but it also painted a target on her back. Admirers sent her poems and letters, some published in the papers, extolling her virtues in flowery verse. One such admirer was a cork cutter named Joseph Morse, who became infatuated and even proposed marriage, though Mary rebuffed him. Another was Alfred Crommelin, a boarder at the Rogers home, who harbored unspoken affections. And then there was Daniel Payne, a handsome but troubled cork cutter, a profession involving cutting corks for bottles, who would become her fiancé. Payne, described as dashing yet melancholic, courted Mary with persistence, and by 1840 they were engaged, a union that seemed promising but was shadowed by Payne's bouts of depression and heavy drinking. As we delve deeper into Mary's world, it's essential to understand the broader context of 1840s New York. The city was a powder keg of social change. The population had swelled to over 300,000, fueled by waves of Irish and German immigrants fleeing famine and unrest in Europe. Tenements sprang up like weeds, overcrowding bred disease, and crime was rampant. The police force was rudimentary, a ragtag group of watchmen without uniforms or modern training, more prone to corruption than crime-solving. Newspapers, the primary source of information, competed fiercely, often prioritizing sensation over accuracy. James Gordon Bennett's Herald, with its bold headlines and graphic details, set the tone for what we now call yellow journalism. Against this backdrop, Mary's life seemed charmed yet precarious. She continued working at Anderson's until early 1841, when she left the job, possibly due to the overwhelming attention or family pressures. Rumors swirled that John Anderson had developed an inappropriate interest in her, though evidence is scant. Mary retreated to a quieter existence at the Nassau Street boarding house, helping her mother with lodgers and planning her future with Payne, but tranquility was short-lived. On a fateful Sunday in July 1841, Mary stepped out once more, dressed in a white dress with a blue scarf, parasol in hand, telling her mother she was off to visit her aunt or cousins uptown. The weather was sweltering, the streets alive with Sunday strollers heading to churches or parks. She never returned. As the sun set that evening, Phoebe Rogers grew anxious. By Monday, alarm bells rang. Friends and family searched, but no trace. The newspapers, remembering her 1838 vanishing act, initially treated it lightly, perhaps another hoax, but as days passed without word, dread mounted. Then on Wednesday, July 28, 1841, fishermen near Sybil's Cave in Hoboken, New Jersey, a popular picnic spot across the Hudson, spotted something horrific bobbing in the water. It was a body, bloated and disfigured, snagged on rocks near the shore. Word spread like fire through dry grass. Crowds gathered, boats ferried gawkers from Manhattan, and soon the corpse was identified by her clothing and distinctive features. It was Mary Rogers. The discovery sent shockwaves through the city. Her body bore marks of unspeakable violence, bruises on her face and neck, suggesting strangulation, her dress torn as if in a desperate struggle, signs that she had been bound and possibly raped. The coroner's examination, conducted hastily on the Hoboken shore amid a growing mob, confirmed the brutality. She had been violated by more than one before death, her throat compressed with a strip of lace from her own petticoat. The verdict, murder most foul. But who and why? The investigation, led by Justice Gilbert Merritt of Hoboken and New York authorities, stumbled from the start. Witnesses came forward with conflicting accounts. Some claimed to have seen Mary boarding a ferry to Hoboken with a tall, dark-complexioned man. Others spoke of hearing screams from a thicket near the river that Sunday afternoon. Suspicion fell on various suspects: her fiancé Payne, who had an alibi but acted erratically; the spurned Morse; even Anderson, her former employer. A reward of $1,000, a princely sum, was offered by the mayor, but leads evaporated. The press exploded. Bennett's Herald ran daily updates, decrying police incompetence and speculating on gangs of ruffians prowling the outskirts. Other papers followed suit, turning Mary's tragedy into a morality tale about the perils facing young women in the city. Pamphlets and broadsides sold on street corners, some with lurid illustrations of the crime scene. Poets penned elegies, preachers sermonized on vice and virtue. And in Philadelphia, where Poe was editing Graham's magazine, the author took notice. Fresh off the success of the murders in the Rue Morgue, Poe saw in Mary's case an opportunity to apply his ratiocination, logical deduction, to a real mystery. As Poe began sketching his story, transposing the events to Paris and renaming the victim Mary Rogêt, the real investigation twisted and turned. In August, a breakthrough: clothing items belonging to Mary, a handkerchief, garter, and shoe, were found in a dense thicket near Sybil's Cave, along with signs of a struggle. This shifted the narrative: not drowned in the river, but murdered on land and dumped, but still no culprit. Then in October, Daniel Payne, Mary's fiancé, was found dead in the same Hoboken woods, an empty vial of laudanum beside him. His suicide note to the world: "Here I am on the spot. May God forgive me for my misspent life." Was it guilt, heartbreak, or something more sinister? These questions lingered as winter approached, the case growing colder with each passing day. But Poe pressed on, publishing the first installment of The Mystery of Mary Rogêt in November 1842, promising to unravel the enigma through Dupin's brilliance. Little did he know that new revelations would force him to revise his tale midstream, exposing the limits of even his formidable mind. Mystery of Mary Rogers. Let's pick up right where we left off. With the case growing colder in the waning months of 1841, the public clamor reaching fever pitch, and Edgar Allan Poe poised to immortalize the tragedy in fiction. The winter chill that settled over New York did little to cool the heated speculations swirling through saloons, society parlors, and the inky columns of the press. If anything, the distance from that sweltering July day only amplified the enigma, transforming Mary's murder from a local horror into a national obsession. Reporters, amateur sleuths, and even politicians weighed in, each offering theories that ranged from the plausible to the outlandish. Was it a crime of passion by a jilted lover, a random act of violence by river pirates haunting the Hudson's shores, or something more insidious, tied to the underbelly of the city's burgeoning vice trade? Central to the evolving narrative was the role of Hoboken itself, a picturesque yet perilous enclave just a ferry ride from Manhattan. In the 1840s, Hoboken was a favored retreat for New Yorkers seeking respite from the urban grind. Its Elysian fields, a verdant park dotted with groves and walking paths, drew picnickers, lovers, and families on sunny afternoons. Sybil's Cave, a natural spring grotto named after the ancient prophetess, was a novelty attraction where visitors sipped mineral water believed to have curative properties. But beneath this idyllic facade lurked dangers. The area was notorious for its taverns, gambling dens, and transient population of sailors, laborers, and ne'er-do-wells. Gangs like the Hookers and Dead Rabbits, precursors to later organized crime, prowled the outskirts, preying on the unwary. It was in this duality of beauty and brutality that Mary's fate unfolded, her body washing up near the very spots where couples strolled hand in hand. The initial investigation, hampered by jurisdictional squabbles between New York and New Jersey authorities, yielded frustratingly few leads. Justice Merritt, a Hoboken official with limited resources, conducted the inquest on the spot, amid a chaotic crowd that trampled potential evidence. The body was interred quickly in a Hoboken cemetery, but not before gawkers paid a fee to view it, a macabre spectacle that underscored the era's fascination with death. Back in New York, Police Chief Jacob Hayes, a veteran lawman known for his no-nonsense approach, dispatched officers to interview witnesses. One key account came from a ferryman who recalled seeing Mary cross to Hoboken with a swarthy companion, described as tall, dark-haired, and possibly of foreign extraction. Sketches circulated in the papers, but no one came forward to identify him. Suspicion soon turned inward toward those closest to Mary. Daniel Payne, her fiancé, was grilled repeatedly. His alibi that he had spent the day wandering the city in a melancholic haze held up under scrutiny, supported by barkeeps who remembered his somber drinking. Yet Payne's behavior post-murder raised eyebrows. He haunted the crime scene, sleeping rough in the Hoboken woods as if searching for clues or atonement. His eventual suicide in October, with that cryptic note, only deepened the mystery. Did guilt drive him to it, or was it despair over losing his beloved, compounded by public accusations? Autopsy revealed opium overdose, but no definitive proof of involvement in the crime. John Anderson, the cigar shop owner, faced scrutiny too. Rumors persisted that he harbored romantic feelings for Mary, perhaps even pressuring her to leave her job. His wealth and connections made him a tantalizing suspect, but alibis from employees placed him in the city that Sunday. Joseph Morse, the rejected suitor, had a weaker defense. He vanished briefly after the murder, only to resurface with vague explanations. Alfred Crommelin, the boarder smitten with Mary, provided an alibi but later played a curious role. He exhumed her body in August for reburial in New York, citing a desire to honor her properly, a gesture that struck some as overly possessive. As autumn leaves fell, a new theory emerged that would scandalize the nation, the possibility that Mary's death stemmed from a botched abortion. In 1840s America, abortion was a shadowy, semi-legal practice, often sought by unmarried women or those in precarious situations. Though not explicitly outlawed until later decades, it was shrouded in taboo, performed in backrooms by female physicians or midwives. Enter Anne Lohman, better known as Madame Ristel, an infamous abortionist whose lavish Madison Avenue mansion belied her controversial trade. Ristel, an English immigrant who rose from poverty to notoriety, advertised discreetly in newspapers as offering preventative powders and female monthly pills, code for abortifacients. Her services catered to the elite and desperate alike, and she amassed a fortune while dodging arrests. How did Ristel connect to Mary? The link surfaced through Frederica Loss, proprietress of Nick Moore's house, a roadside inn near the murder site in Hoboken. In late 1841, as police pressure mounted, Loss came forward with a startling claim. On that fateful Sunday, a young woman matching Mary's description arrived at the inn accompanied by a man seeking a room. They stayed briefly, during which screams were heard, suggesting labor or distress. The woman died, loss alleged, from complications of an abortion performed by her son, and the body was disposed of in the river. This bombshell aligned with coroner's findings of possible pregnancy and internal injuries consistent with such a procedure. But was it true? Skeptics pointed out inconsistencies. Loss's story shifted over time, and she had motive to deflect blame, as her inn was a known haunt for illicit activities. Moreover, Ristell's name was invoked sensationally by the press, perhaps to sell papers or advance anti-abortion agendas. Ristell herself denied involvement, suing newspapers for libel and continuing her practice undeterred. Yet the theory gained traction, especially when linked to Mary's 1838 disappearance. Perhaps that too was an abortion-related absence, a rest cure at a discreet facility. This abortion angle captivated Edgar Allan Poe, who was serializing The Mystery of Marie Rogêt in Snowdon's Lady's Companion after Graham's magazine. Poe's tale, framed as a sequel to Rue Morgue, featured the Parisian detective C. Auguste Dupin analyzing newspaper clippings of Marie's murder from afar. Poe meticulously paralleled real events. Marie, a perfumery girl echoing the cigar shop, disappears, her body found in the Seine with signs of violence. Dupin dismisses gang theories, arguing for a single perpetrator, and critiques police bungling, mirroring real criticisms of Hayes and Merritt. Poe's initial installments, published in November 1842 and February 1843, posited that Marie was murdered on land, not drowned, based on forensic details like lack of water in lungs. He even suggested the killer revisited the scene, drawing from the found clothing in the thicket. But then came a twist. In June 1843, just before the final installment, new evidence from the real case, possibly influenced by Loss's claims, forced Poe to revise. He incorporated the abortion theory subtly, having Dupin conclude that Marie died during a medical procedure gone wrong, her body staged to look like murder. Poe claimed his story solved the mystery before facts emerged, a boast of his analytical prowess. Yet critics noted he altered details post-publication in collected editions to better fit revelations, undermining his prescience. Nonetheless, Marie Rogêt pioneered true crime fiction, influencing Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes and modern procedurals. It highlighted media's role in shaping public perception, as Poe used actual headlines to build his narrative. Back in reality, the case dragged on. In 1842, Governor William Seward offered a $500 reward, spurring more tips but no arrests. A man named Adam Lutz was briefly detained, an abortionist linked to Ristell, but released for lack of evidence. Frederica Loss's sons were questioned, one fled, another died suspiciously, fueling conspiracy talk. By 1843, interest waned, eclipsed by other scandals like the Mexican-American War rumblings. Yet Mary's ghost lingered. Her mother, Phoebe, heartbroken, closed the boarding house and faded from view. Crommelin erected a monument at her grave, inscribed with poignant verse. The murder spurred calls for police reform, contributing to the 1845 creation of New York's first professional force. It also amplified debates on women's safety, urban vice, and journalism ethics. Bennett's Herald was accused of exploiting tragedy for profit. As years passed, theories proliferated. Some blamed immigrant gangs, others a jealous rival. In the 20th century, historians revisited, suggesting Mary was victim of a sex trafficking ring or even Poe himself, absurdly. Forensic re-examinations proposed drowning as cause, contradicting Poe, but closure eluded. Mary's killer or killers slipped into history's shadows, leaving a tapestry of what-ifs. In Part 3, we'll delve into cultural ripple effects, how the case inspired literature beyond Poe, shaped Victorian views on gender and crime, and echoed in later unsolved mysteries like Jack the Ripper. The threads unravel further. Join us. We step directly into the long shadows cast by the cultural earthquake her death triggered, shadows that stretched far beyond the muddy banks of the Hudson and the ink-stained newsrooms of 1840s New York. The case refused to die quietly. Even as official inquiries sputtered and rewards gathered dust on municipal ledgers, the story of the beautiful Cigar Girl metastasized into something larger. A mirror held up to an anxious, rapidly modernizing society, confronting its own contradictions about gender, sexuality, urban danger, journalistic responsibility, and the very nature of truth in an age of mass print media. One of the most immediate and visible ripples was the way Mary's murder accelerated, and in many ways legitimized, the sensationalist style of reporting that James Gordon Bennett had pioneered at the New York Herald. Before July 1841, newspapers had dabbled in scandal, but the Rogers case became the template for what would later be called yellow journalism and eventually tabloid culture. Bennett understood instinctively that readers did not merely want facts, they craved narrative, emotion, moral outrage, and the illusion of participation. Day after day, the Herald published fresh developments, interviews with ferry captains who claimed to have seen suspicious men, anonymous letters purporting to be from the killer, detailed and often invented descriptions of Mary's final hours. When Frederica Loss's abortion story broke, Bennett ran it verbatim, then followed with editorials condemning the monster in petticoats, Restell, while simultaneously printing paid advertisements for her very services on adjacent pages, a hypocrisy that drew sharp criticism even then but sold tens of thousands of extra copies. Other papers, sensing blood in the water, joined the frenzy. The New York Sun, the Transcript, the Commercial Advertiser, and even smaller weeklies scrambled to outdo one another. Some hired artists to produce woodcut illustrations, crude but dramatic, of Mary's lifeless form floating near Sybil's cave, her white dress billowing like a shroud, her dark hair fanned across the water. These images, reproduced by the thousands on cheap broadsides hawked for a penny on street corners, became some of the earliest examples of true crime visual propaganda in American history. They fixed in the public mind an indelible picture of violated innocence, even as the actual forensic details remained murky and contested. The moral panic that ensued was both predictable and profound. Ministers mounted pulpits from Brooklyn to Boston to denounce the licentiousness of city life that had allowed such a crime to occur. Pamphlets bearing titles like The Awful Disclosure or The Murder of the Beautiful Cigar Girl circulated in churches and lyceums, blending genuine grief with prurient fascination. Young women were warned against venturing alone beyond the respectable districts, against accepting invitations from charming strangers, against working in any establishment that placed them on public display. The cigar shop itself became a symbol of peril. Within months of Mary's death, several other pretty shop girls across Manhattan quietly resigned or were dismissed by nervous proprietors who feared similar tragedies, or at least similar headlines. Yet beneath the outrage ran a powerful current of ambivalence. Mary had not been a passive victim in the Victorian mold of the cloistered maiden. She had worked in full view of hundreds of men every day, smiled at them, bantered with them, accepted their compliments and small gifts. To many commentators, this made her complicit, at least partially, in her own fate. Editorial after editorial asked variations of the same question. What was a respectable young woman doing behind the counter of a tobacco emporium in the first place? The implication was clear. Beauty on display invited danger, and danger unchecked invited tragedy. In this way, the case became an early battleground in the long American argument over female autonomy, public visibility, and personal responsibility, an argument that would echo through every subsequent high-profile murder of a young woman, from Lizzie Borden to John Bennett Ramsey. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic and across the decades, the literary afterlife of Mary Rogers began to take on a life of its own. Edgar Allan Poe's The Mystery of Marie Rogêt, though commercially modest when first serialized, gradually acquired canonical status as one of the earliest attempts to apply fictional detective logic to a real crime. Arthur Conan Doyle, when he sat down in 1887 to write A Study in Scarlet, had almost certainly read Poe's tale and its predecessor, The Murders in the Rue Morgue. Sherlock Holmes's method, sifting newspaper accounts, reconstructing timelines, dismissing red herrings through cold reason, owes an unmistakable debt to C. Auguste Dupin. Yet where Poe used the Rogers case to showcase deductive brilliance, Doyle would later insist that Holmes dealt only in fiction. He wanted no part of real mysteries, which he considered too messy, too contaminated by human error and journalistic distortion. Still, the Rogers case refused to stay neatly confined to the realm of proto-detective fiction. In the 1850s and 1860s, it resurfaced periodically whenever a similar crime, a strangled shop girl, a body fished from the river, reawakened public memory. During the Civil War, when newspapers needed diversion from battlefield carnage, editors occasionally reprinted the old woodcuts and rehashed the old theories. After the war, as New York grew into an industrial colossus of over 1 million souls, the story acquired the patina of quaint antiquity, a cautionary tale from a simpler, though no less brutal, time. The 1870s brought another layer of reinterpretation. The rise of the women's suffrage movement prompted a small but vocal cohort of writers to revisit Mary's story not as a morality play, but as a crime enabled by systemic disregard for women's safety. In 1874, suffragist and journalist Victoria Woodhull, already notorious for her advocacy of free love and her accusation that Henry Ward Beecher had committed adultery, published a lengthy essay in Woodhull and Claflin's Weekly arguing that Mary's murder was the inevitable result of a society that sexualized women while denying them economic independence or legal protection. Woodhull pointed out that had Mary possessed the vote, or the right to own property in her own name, or access to safe medical care without fear of prosecution, the chain of circumstances leading to her death might have been broken long before that July Sunday. Though her piece reached only a limited audience, it planted a seed, the notion that unsolved murders of women were not merely individual tragedies, but symptoms of larger structural failures. By the 1880s, as Jack the Ripper began his brief, savage career in London's Whitechapel district, journalists on both sides of the Atlantic drew explicit parallels. The Ripper's methodical mutilation of prostitutes seemed, to some, a grotesque amplification of whatever violence had befallen Mary Rogers. Papers in New York ran side-by-side sketches, the serene face of the beautiful Cigar Girl beside the unrecognizable features of Polly Nichols or Annie Chapman. Editorial writers asked whether the same species of fiend could have crossed the ocean, or whether the two cases simply proved that modern cities inevitably bred monsters who preyed on vulnerable women. The comparison was overwrought. Ripper victims were streetwalkers operating in a far more marginal social stratum, but it kept Mary's name alive in the popular imagination at a time when it might otherwise have faded entirely. The turn of the century brought yet another wave of interest, this time from the emerging field of criminology. Pioneers like Cesare Lombroso in Italy and Hans Gross in Austria-Hungary were attempting to classify criminal types and develop systematic methods of investigation. American academics and police reformers looked to famous cold cases for object lessons. In 1901, a lengthy article in the American Journal of Criminology used the Rogers murder to illustrate the fatal consequences of poor evidence preservation, jurisdictional rivalry, and reliance on newspaper speculation rather than forensic science. The author noted bitterly that had the Hoboken thicket been cordoned off immediately, had the body been photographed before decomposition advanced, had autopsies been performed by trained pathologists rather than local physicians, the case might have yielded answers instead of legends. Popular fiction continued to mine the story as well. In the first decades of the 20th century, dime novels and pulp magazines churned out countless variations. The Cigar Girl's Secret, Who Strangled Mary Rogers. The Hoboken Horror most followed a predictable formula. The killer was usually revealed to be a jealous foreign suitor or a deranged abortionist, but a few displayed genuine ingenuity. One 1912 novella, by an anonymous author posited that Mary had been murdered by members of a secret society linked to the early Freemasons, a theory that drew amused commentary from genuine Masonic historians who pointed out that the fraternity had no presence whatever in Hoboken in 1841. The most curious literary descendant, however, appeared in 1929 when novelist and true crime enthusiast Irving Wallace, not yet famous for the Chapman Report or The Word, published a short book titled simply The Beautiful Cigar Girl. Wallace had spent years combing through yellowed newspaper files, coroner's reports, and surviving letters. His conclusion was startling. He argued that Mary had not been murdered at all, but had died during a self-induced or amateur abortion, after which her companions, perhaps Frederica Loss's sons, panicked and disposed of the body in the river to avoid scandal. Wallace pointed to inconsistencies in the coroner's language, violated by more than one, could mean multiple instruments rather than multiple assailants, the absence of defensive wounds on Mary's hands, and the curious fact that no one ever identified the swarthy man seen with her on the ferry. To Wallace, these details suggested not a sex crime, but a medical tragedy covered up in terror. Wallace's thesis, though speculative, gained a measure of academic respectability when medical historian Amy Gilman Esrubnik revisited the case in her 1995 book, The Mysterious Death of Mary Rogers, Sex and Culture in 19th-Century New York. Esrubnik agreed that the abortion explanation fit the known facts better than any murder scenario. She placed the tragedy squarely within the context of antebellum reproductive politics. The criminalization of abortion was accelerating, safe options were vanishing, and poor and working-class women bore the brunt of the danger. In Esrubnik's reading, Mary becomes less a passive victim than a young woman exercising desperate agency in a world that offered her few choices. This interpretation has largely held sway among serious historians ever since. Yet it has not extinguished the older, darker theories. Online forums, true crime podcasts, and YouTube documentaries still debate whether Daniel Payne staged his suicide to deflect suspicion, whether John Anderson paid for silence, whether the entire Loss family concocted their story to shield a more powerful client. Some amateur researchers insist that modern forensic techniques, DNA from surviving hair samples, digital reconstruction of the Hoboken landscape, could finally name the killer if only the original evidence had been preserved. And so the story circles back, as all great unsolved mysteries do, to the unknowable. We know Mary Cecilia Rogers lived, laughed, worked, loved, and died in terror on a hot July day in 1841. We know her beauty became currency, then obituary. We know her name briefly illuminated the fault lines of an emerging modern world, fault lines of gender, class, media, medicine, and justice. But we do not know, and almost certainly never will know, the final sequence of moments that ended her life. We will widen the lens still further, tracing how the cultural memory of Mary Rogers intersected with parallel mysteries of the Victorian era. The Roadhouse murders, the trunk mysteries, the phantom killer narratives that haunted American and British cities alike. We will examine the strange persistence of certain archetypes, the beautiful victim, the shadowy foreign stranger, the botched medical procedure, and ask why these patterns have proven so durable across 2 centuries of crime storytelling. The river still flows, the questions still drift upon it. We follow where they lead. As we glide onward through the echoing corridors of this 19th century enigma, we arrive precisely where the previous thread left us. At the persistent archetypes that Mary Rogers helped crystallize in the collective imagination, the beautiful victim displayed for public consumption, the shadowy foreign stranger who appears and vanishes, the botched medical procedure shrouded in secrecy and shame, and at the question of why these patterns have proven so extraordinarily durable across 2 full centuries of crime storytelling. The river of narrative never quite stills. New currents keep rushing in, carrying fragments of older mysteries and depositing them at unexpected bends. Let us begin by mapping those parallel Victorian-era cases that so clearly drank from the same dark well as Mary's story. The 1840s and 1850s were especially fertile for what journalists of the day termed trunk mysteries and roadhouse horrors, crimes in which young women of apparent respectability met violent ends in liminal spaces, inns, ferries, riverbanks, pleasure gardens, places that promised escape yet delivered peril. One of the earliest and most eerily resonant occurred in 1842, scarcely a year after Mary's body surfaced near Sybil's cave. In Philadelphia, the Chesapeake trunk mystery unfolded when dockworkers pried open a large leather traveling trunk that had arrived via steamer from Baltimore. Inside lay the decomposed remains of a young woman later identified through clothing labels and a locket as Ellen Jewett, a 22-year-old courtesan who worked in one of the city's better-class brothels. Her skull had been crushed, apparently with a hatchet, and the murderer had attempted to burn the body before cramming it into the trunk and shipping it away. The press coverage mirrored the Rogers frenzy almost exactly. Daily woodcuts, competing theories, jealous client, vengeful madam, rejected suitor, sermons on urban vice, and the inevitable moral lectures directed at women who strayed from domestic safety. Although a man named Richard Robinson was tried and acquitted, the case, like Mary's, ended in acquittal and permanent ambiguity, feeding the public appetite for unresolved female tragedy. A decade later, in 1852, London produced its own variant. The Road Murder or Constance Kent case. Precursor tensions were already simmering in rural Wiltshire when a 4-year-old boy vanished from Road Hill House. His mutilated body was discovered days later in an outdoor privy throat. Suspicion fell on various household members, including 16-year-old Constance Kent, but no one was convicted at the first inquest. The crime haunted Britain for years, resurfacing in 1865 when Constance dramatically confessed under complex psychological pressure to the killing. Yet even after her confession and imprisonment, questions lingered about motive, about whether she acted alone, about whether the true instigator had escaped justice. The Road Hill case became Britain's domestic counterpart to Mary Rogers, a beautiful, or at least genteel, young figure at the center. A violent death in a semi-public, semi-private space, endless newspaper speculation, and a lingering sense that full truth had slipped away. Across the Atlantic again, the 1870s delivered the Nathan murder in New York, 1870, in which Benjamin Nathan, a wealthy broker, was bludgeoned to death in his own mansion on West 23rd Street. Though the victim was male and elderly, the crime echoed Mary's in its media saturation and the parade of contradictory witness accounts, anonymous letters, and competing detectives. More directly parallel was the 1873 abortion trunk case in Cincinnati, where the body of a young woman named Alice Sterling was found crammed into a zinc-lined trunk that had been shipped by rail from Louisville. Medical examination revealed she had died from perforation of the uterus during an abortion. The press immediately linked the case to Mary Rogers, reviving Frederica Loss's old story in Madame Ristell's name. Once more the narrative settled on the same triad: a pretty working-class girl, a desperate attempt to end a pregnancy, panicked disposal of the evidence, and authorities too slow or too corrupt to untangle the web. These recurring motifs, the attractive young woman, the riverside roadside location, the suggestion of sexual transgression followed by violent concealment, were not accidental. They answered deep cultural needs. In an era when middle-class ideals of womanhood emphasized purity, domesticity, and invisibility outside the home, stories of beautiful victims who ventured into public commercial spaces carried a built-in cautionary charge. They warned that stepping beyond the parlor invited predation. At the same time, the very beauty ascribed to these victims served a double purpose. It rendered their suffering aesthetically compelling, hence the endless woodcuts and poetic elegies, while also implying that such beauty itself was partly to blame. The archetype allowed society to grieve while simultaneously policing boundaries. The shadowy foreign stranger figure performed similar cultural work. In Mary's case, the tall, dark-complexioned man seen on the ferry became a convenient vessel for nativist anxieties. The 1840s were a peak decade for anti-immigrant sentiment in the United States. The Know Nothing Party would soon rise on a platform of hostility toward Irish and German Catholics. Casting the killer as swarthy, possibly Mediterranean or Levantan, allowed editors and readers to externalize the threat, locating evil outside the native-born Protestant community rather than within families, workplaces, or romantic relationships. Similar descriptions appeared in the Ellen Jewett coverage. A dark foreigner was rumored to have purchased the trunk. In the Alice Sterling trunk case, a foreign-looking man bought the ticket, and in countless lesser mysteries. The archetype reassured audiences that danger came from elsewhere, from the arriving ships, the crowded boarding houses, the unfamiliar faces on the street, rather than from brothers, fiancés, employers, or neighbors. The botched abortion motif, meanwhile, crystallized a different set of tensions. By the mid-19th century, the medical profession was aggressively campaigning to criminalize abortion at all stages of pregnancy, reversing earlier common law tolerance for pre-quickening procedures. Regular allopathic physicians sought to displace midwives and irregular practitioners like Madame Ristel, framing them as dangerous charlatans. Sensational cases provided ammunition. Each time a young woman died after a clandestine operation, newspapers could decry the abortion mills, while conveniently ignoring the restrictive laws and social stigma that drove women to such desperate measures in the first place. Mary Rogers thus became an unwilling poster child for the anti-abortion crusade, even though the evidence for abortion in her case remained and remains circumstantial at best. These patterns did not fade with the close of the Victorian era. They mutated and migrated into the new century. The 1890s American axe murder wave, most famously the 1892 Borden case in Fall River, revived the beautiful victim archetype, though now the suspected perpetrator was frequently female, adding a layer of gendered unease. The 1906 Stanford White murder by Harry K. Thaw replayed the theme of beauty on display, Evelyn Nesbit as chorus girl model, destroyed by male possessiveness. In Britain, the 1910 Crippen case, another wife killing with a body disposed of in pieces, echoed the disposal anxieties of the trunk mysteries. Each iteration borrowed from Mary Rogers, the media circus, the dueling theories, the lingering doubt. By the 1920s and 1930s, as true crime magazines like True Detective and Master Detective flourished, the Rogers template was fully codified. Almost every issue featured at least one story of a lovely shop girl or beautiful model slain in tawdry circumstances, with headlines screaming "Who killed the Cigar Girl's heir?" or another Mary Rogers mystery. The formula proved commercially indestructible because it married prurience with moralism. Readers could consume graphic details while feeling righteous indignation. The archetype survived the war years and entered the television age virtually intact. The 1950s saw the Black Dahlia case, Elizabeth Short, 1947, become perhaps the single most famous modern descendant of Mary Rogers. Short's body, severed, drained of blood, posed, was discovered in a Lowe's Angels vacant lot. The press frenzy, the endless speculation about her Hollywood dreams and supposed promiscuity, the parade of false confessions, the permanent lack of resolution, all recapitulated the Rogers template with uncanny precision. Even the nickname Black Dahlia echoed beautiful cigar girl. Both reduced a complex human being to a poetic, marketable image of doomed allure. Subsequent decades produced their own variations. The 1969 Manson murders, especially Sharon Tate, the glamorous victim. The 1977 Son of Sam killings, young women shot while sitting in cars. The 1990s John Bennett Ramsey case, child beauty pageant star found murdered in her own home. Each time the same elements resurfaced: intense media coverage that blurred journalism and entertainment, public fixation on the victim's appearance and lifestyle choices, theories that multiplied faster than evidence could disprove them, and ultimate ambiguity that kept the story alive for decades. Why this durability? Several interlocking reasons suggest themselves. First, the beautiful victim archetype taps into archetypal fears about vulnerability and loss of innocence. In cultures that still symbolically link female virtue to physical purity, the violent destruction of a young, attractive woman triggers profound existential dread. The story becomes a memento mori for an entire gender and class. Second, unresolved mysteries are inherently more narratively powerful than solved ones. A closed case satisfies curiosity but closes the book. An open one invites endless retelling, reinterpretation, participation. Mary Rogers has been solved dozens of times in fiction, in amateur investigations, in academic monographs, yet never definitively, and that lack of finality is the fuel that keeps the fire burning. Third, the story serves as a flexible allegory. Depending on the era, Mary can represent the dangers of women working outside the home, 1850s, the perils of illegal abortion, 1920s, 1970s, the predatory nature of urban anonymity, Gilded Age, the exploitative gaze of mass media today. Each generation finds in her death a reflection of its own anxieties. Fourth, and perhaps most uncomfortably, the archetype sells. From penny broadsides to streaming documentaries, the combination of sex, violence, mystery, and moral indignation has always moved units. Publishers, editors, podcasters, and now algorithm-driven platforms understand this perfectly. Mary Rogers was one of the first commodities in what has become a vast industry of female death entertainment. As we stand on this vantage point, looking back across nearly 2 centuries, the figure of Mary Cecilia Rogers begins to seem less like a historical person and more like a cultural prism. Light enters from different angles: gender politics, medical history, media studies, criminology, literary criticism, and each time a different spectrum emerges. Yet the core silhouette remains, a young woman stepping out on a bright Sunday morning, parasol in hand, never to return home. We will narrow the focus once more, returning to the primary sources themselves, the newspaper articles, coroner's notes, letters, pamphlets, and early pamphlets that first shaped the narrative. We will examine how the language of those documents created the myth even as they purported to report fact, and how that myth-making machinery has been inherited by every subsequent era of crime coverage. The ink may have dried long ago, but its stain spreads still. We turn the fragile pages next. As we now turn the fragile, foxed pages of the primary sources themselves, those brittle newspapers, the handwritten coroner's notes, the hastily printed pamphlets, the personal letters that survived mildew and attic dust, we step back into the raw material from which the myth of Mary Rogers was first constructed. This is the moment where fact and storytelling were still fused together in real time, before later historians, novelists, and documentarians began to filter, reinterpret, reorder, and sometimes invent. Here in the ink of 1841-1843, we can watch the machinery of myth-making take its first turns. Pick up a copy of the New York Herald for Thursday, July 29, 1841, the day after the body was pulled from the water near Sybil's cave. James Gordon Bennett's front page is dominated by a single-column headline in thick black type: "Shocking Murder. The body of a beautiful young female found in the river at Hoboken. Supposed to be Mary Rogers, the Cigar Girl." Below the headline, Bennett launches straight into scene-setting prose that reads today like the opening of a Gothic novella. "The body of an exquisitely beautiful girl was yesterday morning found floating in the water off the Elysian Fields, Hoboken." The corpse was in a state of advanced decomposition, yet the features were still recognizable to those who had known her in life. She was dressed in a white dress of light material, blue silk scarf about the neck, leghorn hat tied under the chin with green ribbon. On the person were found a parasol, a handkerchief marked MR, and other articles which leave no doubt of identity. Notice what Bennett does not yet say. He does not yet call it murder. He says found floating, supposed to be, leave no doubt of identity. Caution still clings to the language because the coroner has not yet ruled, but the adjectives exquisitely beautiful, light material, green ribbon are already doing their work. They paint a picture before the facts have fully settled. They invite the reader to visualize not a corpse, but a tragically lovely young woman whose finery has been preserved even in death. Within hours of those words hitting the streets, crowds were paying boatmen 25 cents apiece to row them across the Hudson so they could view the body themselves before it was removed to a temporary shed on the Hoboken shore. The next day's Herald, July 30, escalates. The coroner's inquest has now been held. The verdict is explicit: death by violence, compression of the neck by means of a piece of lace torn from her own petticoat. Bennett prints the testimony of Dr. Richard F. Cook, the attending physician. The body presented marks of great violence about the face and neck. There were distinct impressions of fingers upon the throat. The tongue protruded. The eyes were much congested. There was evidence of recent connection with more than one person. That final phrase, recent connection with more than one person, is the spark that ignites the most enduring controversy. In 19th-century medical and journalistic language, connection is a euphemism for sexual intercourse. The implication is clear: Mary was raped and by multiple assailants before being strangled, yet Dr. Cook's exact wording is ambiguous enough to allow later reinterpretations. Connection could, in the hands of a determined apologist, be twisted towards surgical or instrumental interference rather than penile rape. But in 1841, the public read it the first way, and the Herald made sure they did. Bennett follows the medical testimony with a lengthy reconstruction of Mary's last known hours, pieced together from witness statements that would later prove contradictory. On Sunday morning between 9 and 10 o'clock, she left her mother's residence in Nassau Street, dressed as above described, stating that she was going to spend the day with an aunt in Bleecker Street. She was seen on the ferryboat to Hoboken in company with a tall, dark-complexioned man of gentlemanly appearance. They were observed walking toward the Elysian fields. About 3 o'clock in the afternoon, several persons in the vicinity heard cries of distress proceeding from a thicket near the river, but no attention was paid to them at the time. Here the narrative solidifies. Mary voluntarily crossed the river with a male companion. Screams were heard. Hours later, her body washed ashore. The tall, dark-complexioned man becomes the first named suspect in the public mind, even though no name is attached. The description is vague enough to fit half the immigrant population of New York, yet specific enough to feed nativist paranoia. By August 1, the Herald has located Mary's clothing in the thicket. A piece of her petticoat, torn into strips, was found tied around her neck. Her garters were discovered some distance away, still fastened to the stockings. A handkerchief and a sunshade were recovered from the same spot. The ground showed signs of a severe struggle: broken branches, trampled grass, blood upon the leaves. This discovery shifts the geography of the crime. No longer is Mary presumed drowned after being thrown into the river alive. Now the killing happened on dry land, in a grove only a short walk from pleasure seekers and picnickers. The implication is chilling. Her screams went unheard or ignored on a sunny Sunday afternoon in one of the most popular resort spots near America's largest city. Pamphlets appeared almost immediately. One of the earliest, printed in early August by a firm on Ann Street and sold for 6 cents, bore the title, "Awful Disclosure." Full particulars of the murder of Mary Rogers, the beautiful Cigar Girl, with a correct likeness. Inside was a crude woodcut purporting to show Mary's face in life: oval features, dark eyes, full lips, hair parted in the middle and drawn back in the fashionable style of the day. Whether the likeness was accurate is doubtful. No authenticated portrait of Mary survives. Yet the image circulated widely, fixing her appearance in the public mind as permanently as any photograph could have done. Personal letters provide another, quieter layer. Phoebe Rogers, Mary's mother, wrote to a cousin in Connecticut on August 10, 1841. The letter survives in a private collection and was quoted in an 1890s retrospective. "My heart is broken beyond mending. They say my poor girl was outraged before she died. I cannot bear to think of it. The newspapers print things I never wish to read again. They call her beautiful as though that were the worst part of it. She was my only child, my comfort. Now she lies in a stranger's ground in Hoboken, and I cannot even afford a proper stone." Phoebe's anguish stands in stark contrast to the journalistic tone. Where Bennett sees a story, she sees desecration. Where the public consumes drama, she confronts irreparable loss. By late August, the abortion theory begins to seep into print, though cautiously at first. The New York Tribune, more restrained than the Herald, runs a small item on August 25. Certain rumors are in circulation connecting the death of Miss Rogers with an attempt at criminal operation. We forbear to repeat the details until more certain information is obtained. The criminal operation phrase is 19th century shorthand for abortion. Within weeks, Frederica Loss steps forward with her affidavit, and the rumor becomes front-page news. Loss's statement, published in the Herald on October 14, 1841, reads in part, "On Sunday, the 25th of July, a young woman answering the description of Mary Rogers came to my house with a man. They asked for a private room. Soon after, I heard cries of pain. I went up and found the girl in great distress. She died shortly afterward. My sons carried the body to the river and placed it among the rocks so it would be found and given Christian burial. The man paid me money to keep silent." Loss's story is riddled with problems, shifting dates, inconsistent details about the man's appearance, convenient timing, but it offers what the public craves: a named location, Nick Moore's house, a cause botched abortion, and a cover-up. Bennett prints it verbatim, then follows with an editorial. If this account be true, then the crime is not murder in the common sense, but manslaughter arising from malpractice. Yet the attempt to conceal the body makes all parties accessories after the fact. The abortion angle gains enough traction that Edgar Allan Poe, then living in Philadelphia, incorporates it into the final installment of The Mystery of Marie Rogêt. In the June 1843 number of Snowden's Ladies' Companion, Dupin concludes, Marie Rogêt met her death during an abortion performed by an unskilled hand. The body was afterward conveyed to the riverbank and disposed of in such a manner as to suggest violence at the hands of ruffians. Poe's fictional detective arrives at the same conclusion Frederica Loss offered, yet Poe claims he reached it before Loss's affidavit became widely known, using only newspaper accounts available in Philadelphia. Whether he truly anticipated the twist or quietly revised the tale after new facts emerged has been debated ever since. Other primary documents complicate rather than clarify. Daniel Payne's suicide note, found beside his body in the Hoboken woods on October 7, 1841, reads, "Here I am on the very spot. God forgive me my misspent life. I die for the girl I loved. D.C. Payne." The note contains no confession, only grief and self-reproach. Yet its location, within a few hundred yards of where Mary's clothing was found, keeps suspicion alive. Was Payne returning to the scene out of guilt, nostalgia, or masochistic mourning? By 1842, the volume of primary material had grown enormous. Coroners' transcripts, witness depositions, reward circulars, even a small printed hymn sheet titled "Lament for Mary Rogers" sold at street corners. One verse ran, "Oh, lovely girl with raven hair, who smiled at all who came, now cold and still by river's edge, in death you bear no name." The doggerel is poor, but it captures the sentimental tone that quickly overlaid the horror. As we sift these sources, a pattern emerges. Almost every document, whether newspaper column, coroner's finding, or pamphlet, does two things simultaneously. It reports facts and it shapes interpretation. Bennett does not merely tell us Mary was beautiful, he tells us her beauty matters, that it explains both her popularity and her peril. Dr. Cook does not merely describe injuries, he uses language, connection with more than one person, that invites moral judgment. Frederica Loss does not merely confess, she offers a narrative that deflects blame from random violence toward a medical tragedy that can be condemned without implicating the entire social order. This dual function, reporting and mythologizing, is the DNA of modern true crime coverage. Every podcast episode, every Netflix docuseries, every Reddit deep dive thread inherits the same machinery. The primary sources of 1841 show us how early the pattern was set. Select vivid detail, amplify emotional resonance, leave enough ambiguity to fuel speculation, and never let the story rest. As we now follow the trail of ink forward through time, watching how the 19th century techniques of framing female homicide, first perfected in the Mary Rogers coverage, were adopted, refined, occasionally subverted, and ultimately industrialized by successive generations of media. We pick up exactly where those original documents left their deepest imprint, in the dual act of reporting a death while simultaneously mythologizing it. The machinery did not rust after 1843. It was oiled, upgraded, and put to work again and again, each time producing a slightly altered but recognizably related product. The first major evolution occurred in the final 2 decades of the 1800s, as daily journalism shifted from the partisan sheets of the antebellum era to the mass circulation, penny press descendants that would dominate the Gilded Age. By the 1880s, the technological and economic conditions had changed dramatically. Steam-powered rotary presses could churn out tens of thousands of copies per hour. Linotype machines introduced 1886 sped composition. Photo engraving began replacing hand-drawn woodcuts. Telegraph wires and railroad distribution networks turned local crimes into national news within hours rather than days. The audience had changed too. Urban literacy rates climbed, immigrant populations swelled, and cheap newspapers became the primary entertainment for the working class. Sensationalism was no longer an occasional tactic, it was the business model. The archetype of the beautiful victim in peril found its most lurid and influential restatement in the Jack the Ripper murders of 1888. London's Whitechapel killings were not solved, just like Mary S., and the press response echoed the Rogers template with uncanny precision. The Star, the Pall Mall Gazette, and especially after the Dear Boss letter, virtually every London daily ran daily front-page updates. They printed crude sketches of the victims' faces in life drawn from whatever photographs or descriptions existed, detailed the condition of the bodies in language that hovered between clinical and voyeuristic, speculated wildly about the killer's identity, foreign surgeon, mad aristocrat, Jewish butcher, and editorialized on the moral decay of the East End. The phrase, "a woman of the unfortunate class," became the Ripper-era euphemism for prostitute, just as beautiful Cigar Girl had once euphemized Mary's public-facing job while hinting at her vulnerability. Yet there were meaningful shifts. Where the 1841 coverage had still carried traces of Victorian sentimentality, elegies, poems, calls for Christian burial, the Ripper press was colder, more cynical. Editors understood that outrage sold, but so did fear and titillation. When Catherine Eddowes was found mutilated in Mitre Square, the Star ran a headline that read, "Another fiendish crime, horrible mutilation in the heart of London, the fiend still at large." No morning verse followed. Instead came diagrams of the crime scene, maps showing the proximity of police beats, and interviews with terrified residents who claimed to have heard nothing. The coverage also introduced a new element that would become standard in later true crime media, the pseudo-forensic reconstruction. Reporters stood in alleyways at the approximate hour of death, timing how long it would take to walk from one murder site to the next, estimating blood flow rates, debating whether the killer could have washed his hands in a public sink without attracting notice. This proto-procedural style, part detective work, part performance, was a direct descendant of Poe's Dupin analyzing newspaper scraps, but now it was done in real time by dozens of competing journalists. Across the Atlantic, the same toolkit was applied to domestic cases. The 1897 murder of Carrie Brown, known in the press as Old Shakespeare, a 50-year-old prostitute found strangled and mutilated in a Lower East Side hotel room, was immediately labeled Jack the Ripper in New York. The World and the Journal, Hearst's paper, ran competing daily editions with increasingly graphic descriptions. When an Algerian named Amir Ben Ali was arrested, tried, and convicted largely on circumstantial evidence, bloodstains in an adjoining room, both papers claimed victory for their investigative reporting. Yet years later, serious doubts emerged about the conviction, and Ali was pardoned in 2023 after more than a century. The case showed how the Rogers Ripper template could be used to produce not just ambiguity but a rush to judgment. name a suspect quickly, convict in the court of public opinion, and let the legal system catch up or not. The early 20th century brought another inflection point, the rise of the illustrated tabloid and the wire services. By the 1920s, papers like the New York Daily News and the Chicago Tribune were printing actual crime scene photographs, heavily retouched or cropped, alongside the familiar woodcut-style artist renderings. The 1927 Snyder Gray case, the burning bed murder, offers a textbook example of how the archetype evolved under these new conditions. Ruth Snyder, a Long Island housewife, and her lover Judd Gray bludgeoned her husband to death, staged a burglary, and set the bed on fire. The Daily News published a now famous and shocking photograph of Ruth in the electric chair moments after execution, her skirt hiked up, legs exposed, the image taken with a hidden camera strapped to a journalist's ankle. The photo ran under the headline, "Dead, no further text was needed." The picture did the work that 1841 reporters had once accomplished with adjectives. It reduced a complex human being to an instantly consumable image of punished femininity. Where Mary Rogers had been mourned, at least rhetorically, as a lost innocent, Ruth Snyder was presented as a femme fatale whose beauty and sexuality had led directly to violence. The shift reflects broader cultural changes, women's suffrage, the flapper era, rising divorce rates, but the underlying mechanism remained the same. Use the victim's or perpetrator's appearance as the emotional hook, then layer on moral judgment. The wire services, Associated Press, United Press, International News Service, spread the template nationally and internationally. A small-town murder in Iowa or Oregon could now be packaged with the same rhetorical and visual grammar that had once been reserved for Manhattan sensations. The 1930s torso murderer of Cleveland, never caught, and the 1940s lipstick killer of Chicago both received coast-to-coast coverage that borrowed freely from the 1841 playbook. Focus on the victims, youth and attractiveness, describe clothing in loving detail, speculate about sexual motive, leave the killer shadowy and undefined. Television arrived in the late 1940s and early 1950s, and the machinery adapted again. Live broadcasts from crime scenes were impossible at first, but newsreels and then nightly newscasts could show exterior shots of buildings, interviews with neighbors, and most powerfully, photographs of victims supplied by families or police. The 1947 Black Dahlia case became the bridge between print tabloid culture and the emerging television era. Elizabeth Short's body, bisected at the waist, posed with arms above her head, face slashed into a Glasgow smile, was discovered in a Lowe's Angels lot on January 15. Within hours, wire photos of the crime scene, carefully cropped to avoid the worst gore, were appearing in newspapers nationwide. By evening, radio bulletins had turned Black Dahlia into a household phrase. When television news matured in the 1950s, documentaries and specials on the still unsolved case replayed the same narrative beats. Lingering shots of Short's headshots, the glamorous publicity stills she had used in her brief Hollywood aspirations, somber voiced narration about her dreams and her supposed fast life, endless repetition of the phrase beautiful but doomed. The Dahlia coverage also introduced a new layer, the victim as aspirational figure. Mary Rogers had been a shop clerk whose beauty made her locally famous. Elizabeth Short was a would-be starlet whose beauty made her symbolically Hollywood's sacrificial lamb. The story could be packaged as a warning about the dangers of chasing fame in a big city, just as Mary's had warned against taking a job behind a public counter. Both narratives allowed audiences to consume the tragedy while feeling safely distant from it. Cable news in the 1980s and 1990s accelerated the cycle. The 1994-1995 O.J. Simpson trial, though not a classic female victim mystery, borrowed heavily from the old template in its treatment of Nicole Brown Simpson. Endless circulation of her smiling photographs, interviews with friends who described her as beautiful and vivacious, speculation about domestic violence framed partly as jealousy over her looks. Court TV and CNN ran the same images on loop, turning them into icons as fixed as the 1841 woodcut of Mary. The 1996 John Bennett Ramsey case pushed the archetype into even darker territory. A 6-year-old beauty pageant contestant found murdered in her own basement. The media response, 24-hour coverage, aerial shots of the house, close-ups of John Bennett in tiara and sequins, replicated every element of the Rogers template, youth and beauty as central motif, unresolved mystery, moral panic about a social practice that placed girls on display, while adding the new horror of child victimhood. The digital era and social media completed the industrialization. By the 2010s, platforms like Reddit, YouTube, TikTok, and true crime podcasts had democratized the machinery. Anyone with a laptop could now assemble the classic ingredients: victim photographs, timeline graphics, dramatic readings of primary documents, speculative theories, and reach millions. The Delphi murders 2017, the Gabby Petito case 2021, and countless others followed the pattern so faithfully that they sometimes felt like deliberate reenactments. Release a still from a surveillance video showing a pretty young woman walking alone. Let the internet speculate about the shadowy figure nearby, watch the hashtags multiply, and wait for the next development to drop. Yet subversion has occurred too. Some modern creators deliberately invert the old gaze. Podcasts like My Favorite Murder or Crime Junkie emphasize victim-centered storytelling, refusing to linger on appearance unless it serves empathy rather than titillation. Documentaries such as The Keepers, 2017, or I'll Be Gone in the Dark, 2020, spend as much time on institutional failures and survivor testimony as on the crime itself. These works inherit the Rogers template, but redirect its emotional energy toward justice rather than spectacle. Still, the underlying impulse persists because it is rooted in something older than any medium. Humans have always told stories about beautiful figures destroyed by violence. The impulse appears in Greek tragedy, in medieval ballads, in Victorian sensation novels. Mary Rogers did not invent the archetype. She simply gave it its first mass media dress rehearsal in a democratic, urbanizing society. Every subsequent iteration is a variation on that original performance. We will zoom in on one particularly revealing case that stands midway between Mary's time and our own, the 1950s-1960s Boston Strangler investigation. We will examine how the same rhetorical and visual strategies were deployed when serial murder entered the public consciousness, how television changed the pacing and emotional rhythm of coverage, and how the eventual and still controversial identification of Albert DeSalvo as the killer attempted, yet failed, to close a narrative that had been designed from its first newspaper headline to remain open. The spotlight shifts to Boston next. As we shift the spotlight to Boston and the shadowy decade-plus of terror that became known as the Boston Strangler era, roughly 1962-1964 for the core killings, though the label stretched backward and forward in public memory, we arrive at a pivotal midway point between the ink-stained sensationalism of Mary Rogers's time and the hyper-accelerated, multi-screen true crime ecosystem of the 21st century. The Strangler case is where many of the framing techniques we have traced so far, victim beauty as emotional anchor, unresolved mystery as narrative engine, media speculation filling every silence, encountered two powerful new forces: the rise of network television as a dominant national medium and the dawning cultural awareness of serial murder as a distinct, terrifying phenomenon. The first generally accepted strangler murder occurred on June 14, 1962. Anna Slessors, 55, was found strangled in her Back Bay apartment with the cord of her housecoat knotted around her neck in an elaborate bow. Her body was partially undressed, legs splayed in a manner that suggested sexual positioning, though no semen was recovered. The Boston Globe's initial coverage the next day was restrained by today's standards, but already carried familiar echoes. Woman slain in Back Bay apartment, strangulation suspected. Robbery not apparent, the article noted her attractive appearance, a phrase that would recur with grim regularity, and described the apartment as neat but modest, subtly coding her as respectable yet vulnerable. Within days, the story had moved inside to page 3. It was tragic, but not yet part of a pattern. By the end of summer 1962, the pattern was undeniable. Nina Nichols, 68, Helen Blake, 65, Ida Erga, 75, and Jane Sullivan, 67, were all found strangled in their apartments, each with a ligature fashioned into a decorative bow, each left in a state of sexual display. The victims were older women living alone, hardly the beautiful young shop girl archetype Mary Rogers had embodied, but the press quickly adapted the template. Headlines began referring to the phantom killer of elderly women, and articles lingered on small details of grooming and dress that could be spun as lingering traces of former attractiveness. Well-kept silver hair, a trace of lipstick still visible, a house dress that had once been pretty. The aging body became a stand-in for lost youth, allowing the same voyeuristic gaze that had once fixed on Mary's raven hair and fair complexion. Then on December 5, 1962, the archetype snapped back into sharper focus. Sophie Clark, 20, a black student nurse, was found strangled in her Brighton apartment. Her youth, her beauty, described in the Record American as strikingly attractive with a model's figure, and the fact that she had reportedly admitted a maintenance man to the building shifted the narrative. The strangler was no longer targeting only the elderly and isolated. He could strike the young, the vibrant, the hopeful. The Globe ran a studio photograph of Sophie, smiling, poised hair swept back next to crime scene artists' renderings of the ligature bow. The juxtaposition was deliberate and devastating, life/death, beauty/violation. From that point forward, the Boston Strangler became a national story. ABC, CBS, and NBC evening newscasts carried regular updates. Walter Cronkite's measured baritone would introduce segments with lines like, "Another woman has been found slain in Boston in what police now fear is the work of a single deranged killer." The broadcasts showed exterior shots of apartment buildings, reporters standing on snowy sidewalks interviewing shaken neighbors, and when families permitted, studio portraits of the victims in life. These photographs functioned exactly as the 1841 woodcuts had. They humanized the tragedy, gave viewers someone to mourn, and less overtly invited a gaze that mixed sympathy with fascination. The print press, meanwhile, escalated. The Record American and the Daily Advertiser, both Hearst papers, competed fiercely with the Globe. They published daily strangler file sidebars that listed each victim's name, age, address, date of death, and a one-line physical description. The repetition of format created a grim litany. Anna Slessors, 55, attractive divorcee Nina Nichols, 68, petite and well-groomed Patricia Bissett, 23, pretty secretary, found January 31, 1963. Beverly Simons, 23, attractive music student, found May 6, 1963. Evelyn Corbin, 58, still youthful-looking, found September 8, 1963. Joanne Graff, 23, lovely artist, found November 23. 1963. Mary Brown, 69, neatly dressed, found March 9, 1964. Mary Sullivan, 19, beautiful co-ed, found January 4, 1964. The age range 19 to 69 and the recurring adjectives attractive, pretty, lovely, beautiful kept the Rogers-era emotional hook intact even when the victims were decades past their youth. The media needed a unifying visual and effective thread, and beauty, real or nostalgically projected, became that thread. Television changed the rhythm of coverage in ways print never could. Where 19th-century readers waited for the morning or evening edition, 1960s viewers absorbed updates in near real-time bursts, the 6:30 p.m. national news, the 11 p.m. local wrap-up, occasional special reports. When Mary Sullivan's body was discovered in early 1964, strangled, posed on her bed with a bow around her neck and a New Year's card placed between her toes, the story broke during the dinner hour. Footage showed police carrying a sheet-draped stretcher down the stairs of 44 Gainsborough Street while reporters shouted questions. The image became iconic, replayed for weeks. the case also arrived at the dawn of modern profiling. Boston police consulted Dr. Ames Roby, a psychiatrist at Bridgewater State Hospital, who offered early behavioral insights. The killer likely lived locally, had a menial job that gave him access to apartments, harbored rage toward women, possibly triggered by maternal figures. These ideas were leaked to the press and appeared in Sunday supplements as the mind of the strangler. The public could now imagine the killer not just as a shadowy figure, but as a psychological type, a step toward the FBI behavioral science unit that would formalize profiling in the 1970s. Then came Albert DeSalvo. In March 1965, while incarcerated for a series of sexual assaults known as the Green Man crimes, DeSalvo confessed to being the strangler. He provided details of crime scenes that had never been released publicly. In 1967, he was charged with the murders, though the cases never went to full trial on the homicide counts because prosecutors feared his confession might be ruled inadmissible. It had been obtained during psychiatric interviews without Miranda warnings, which were brand new after Escobedo v. Illinois. DeSalvo was instead convicted of the Green Man assaults and sent to Bridgewater, where he was stabbed to death by another inmate in 1973. The confession should have closed the book. Instead, it opened new chapters of doubt. Forensic inconsistencies mounted over the decades. Hair samples found on some bodies did not match DeSalvo. Ligature patterns varied. Some crime scenes showed no sign of forced entry while others did. In 2001, DNA taken from Mary Sullivan's exhumed body excluded DeSalvo as the source of semen found on her body. The revelation reignited media interest. Court TV, later True TV, ran specials. The Boston Herald published multi-part retrospectives. Documentaries on A&E and Discovery Channel rehashed every theory. The unresolved quality, confession without conviction, DNA that pointed away from the confessor, perfectly suited the archetype. Like Mary Rogers, the Boston Strangler case refused to die. It became a vessel for whatever anxiety the current moment needed. 1960s fears of urban anonymity and sexual deviance, 1980s, 1990s fascination with serial killers as celebrity monsters, Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, Jeffrey Dahmer, 2000 skepticism toward police and forensic certainty in the post-DNA era. Television had trained audiences to expect closure within a 30 or 60-minute episode. When closure did not arrive, the frustration itself became part of the story. Books proliferated. Gerald Frank's 1966 The Boston Strangler, the first major account. Susan Kelly's 1995 The Boston Stranglers, which argued for multiple killers. And Casey Sherman's 2003 A Rose for Mary, written by Mary Sullivan's nephew, each reframing the narrative for its time. The 2008 film Boston Strangler, not the Hulu 2023 dramatization, leaned heavily on the lone madman theory, while the more recent Hulu series starring Keira Knightley as a fictional Globe reporter emphasized institutional sexism and the possibility of multiple perpetrators. Through all of this, the visual language remained remarkably consistent. Crime scene photographs, when released, were cropped tightly around the ligature bows. Victim portraits in life were lit softly, eyes bright, smiles gentle. The bow itself became the signature image, reproduced in documentaries as both forensic clue and macabre artwork. It functioned exactly as Mary's blue silk scarf and green ribbon had in 1841, a small, poignant detail that humanized the victim while simultaneously aestheticizing her death. As we now step fully into the 1970s and 1980s, the decades when serial murder became not just a recurring nightmare but a recognizable cultural category with its own dedicated shelf space in bookstores, its own primetime television slots, and its own lexicon of fear, we pick up exactly where the Boston Strangler's unresolved bow left us. At the moment when the machinery of coverage, already well-oiled by a century of beautiful victim stories, encountered a new kind of perpetrator whose crimes arrived in clusters, spanned years, and invited, and sometimes demanded, long-form multimedia storytelling. The shift was not instantaneous. It coalesced gradually, case by case, until by the late 1970s the phrase serial killer had moved from FBI behavioral science jargon into everyday headlines. Each major case of that era borrowed selectively from the Mary Rogers template while adding new layers suited to the times. Longer investigative timelines, more forensic detail, psychological portraiture, nationwide manhunts, celebrity detectives, both real and fictional, and crucially, the paperback true crime book as a mass-market commodity. David Berkowitz, the son of Sam, provides the clearest early marker. Between July 1976 and July 1977, 6 young women and 1 man were shot in parked cars across Queens, the Bronx, and Brooklyn. The victims were typically attractive, in their late teens or early 20s, often sitting with boyfriends in lovers' lanes. The press response revived every familiar note. Studio photographs of the dead women circulated widely, Donna Lauria smiling in a high school graduation portrait, Valentina Suriani in a prom dress, Stacy Moskovitz beaming beside her fiancé. Newspapers ran daily maps plotting the shootings in red ink, and columnists asked why a killer seemed to target pretty brunettes who looked like the girl next door. The New York Daily News, still riding high on tabloid tradition, gave Berkowitz his nickname after he left a letter at one crime scene taunting police and promising more Sam, his neighbor's dog, he later claimed. The moniker stuck instantly, turning an anonymous shooter into a branded monster. Television amplified the branding. The nightly news showed reporters standing beside bullet-pocked cars under sodium streetlights. Anchormen read Berkowitz's rambling letters aloud in grave tones. Special reports featured criminologists speculating about sexual rage and repressed fantasies. When Berkowitz was arrested on August 10, 1977, thin, unassuming, almost disappointingly ordinary, the relief was palpable, yet the story did not end. Books arrived within months, Son of Sam by Jimmy Breslin and others, the Phantom Prince knock-offs, lurid paperbacks with black covers and dripping red titles. Each recycled the same visual grammar, victim photos on the front or inside flaps, crime scene sketches, excerpts from the taunting letters. The paperback boom had begun. By the end of the decade, the formula was industrial. The Hillside Stranglers, cousins Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono, killed 10 women and girls between October 1977 and February 1978 in Los Angeles and Glendale. The victims ranged from 12-year-old schoolgirls to 28-year-old waitresses, but the media consistently highlighted youth and attractiveness whenever possible. Yolanda Washington, lovely and vivacious, Kimberly Martin, a former cheerleader, Cindy Hudspeth, a pretty USC student. Bodies were found posed on hillsides, naked or partially clothed, legs spread in deliberate display, an echo of the Stranglers' staging but on a larger geographic scale. The Los Angeles Times and Herald Examiner ran aerial photographs of the dump sites, turning scrubland into macabre landmarks. National network specials followed, narrated in the hushed, urgent style that had become standard for serial cases. The paperback market responded with speed and volume. Within 2 years, titles such as The Hillside Stranglers by Darcy O'Brien, 1985, though early editions appeared sooner, The Killing Cousins, and various true crime library installments flooded drugstores and bus stations. Covers almost always featured a composite sketch of the killer, dark hair, mustache, predatory stare, superimposed over a collage of victim photographs or a silhouette of a strangled woman. Inside, chapters alternated between victim biographies, often sentimentalized, police procedure recreations, and speculative dives into the killers, childhoods, and sexual pathologies. The books were short, 150-250 pages, cheaply printed on newsprint grade paper and priced at $1.95, $3.50. They sold in the hundreds of thousands. Television miniseries soon followed. NBC's two-part The Atlanta Child Murders, 1985, dramatized the Wayne Williams case, 1979-1981, though it focused on the 30-plus black boys and young men killed rather than female victims. Still, the production values haunting score, slow pans across Atlanta streets, actors portraying grieving mothers, set a template for later serial killer miniseries. ABC's 1989 The Preppy Murder, Robert Chambers strangling Jennifer Levin in Central Park, leaned harder into the beautiful victim motif. Stock footage of Levin smiling at parties, reenactments of her final night in a short skirt and heels, courtroom close-ups of her parents' tears. The 1990s would see the form explode with The Deliberate Stranger, Ted Bundy, 1986 NBC miniseries, To Catch a Killer, John Wayne Gacy, 1992, and dozens more. Dennis Rader, the BTK killer, bind, torture, kill, operated across the 1970s and into the new century but was only caught in 2005. His case illustrates how the genre matured. Rader sent taunting letters and packages to newspapers and television stations from 1974 onward, poems, drawings, photographs he had taken of bound victims, even a doll posed to mimic one murder. Media outlets initially withheld the most graphic material, but by the late 1970s some details leaked: the careful knots, the plastic bags over heads, the sexual staging. When Rader resurfaced in 2004-2005 with new letters prompted, he later said, by media coverage of his old crimes, local stations in Wichita broadcast scans of his communications, pixelating only the most explicit elements. National cable channels, Court TV, A&Es, Cold Case Files, Investigation Discovery Precursors, ran multi-episode retrospectives once he was arrested. The visual language had evolved. Grainy 1970s Polaroids of victims in life, crime scene sketches were drawn for television, computer-generated animations of the binding process, interviews with surviving family members lit in soft, somber tones. Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, murdered at least 49 women, mostly sex workers, between 1982 and 1998 in the Seattle-Tacoma area. The case received comparatively muted national attention during the active years, partly because the victims were marginalized, partly because the body count accumulated slowly over a vast geography. Local papers, Seattle Times, Post-Intelligencer, ran running tallies and maps of recovery sites along the Green River and Star Lake, but the women were rarely afforded the beautiful descriptor so common in other cases. Coverage focused instead on the failures of law enforcement, the geography of the killings, and the emerging use of computer databases to link cases. When Ridgway was arrested in 2001 and confessed in 2003, the story finally exploded nationally. By then the true crime ecosystem had changed. Court TV aired wall-to-wall coverage, Discovery Channel produced hour-long documentaries, and Ann Rule's 2004 paperback Green River, Running Red, became a bestseller. Rule, already famous for The Stranger Beside Me, her memoir of knowing Ted Bundy, emphasized victim stories over killer psychology, a subtle shift that reflected growing criticism of the genre's voyeurism. Across these cases, the moral conventions hardened into a recognizable pattern, open with victim portraits in life, yearbook photos, driver's licenses, snapshots with friends. Transition to crime scene exteriors or maps. Insert police procedure reenactments or forensic animations. Include interviews with detectives, profilers, surviving relatives. Build suspense through unanswered questions. How did he choose them? Why did he stop? End when possible with arrest and confession footage, though many cases, Zodiac, Original Night Stalker, deliberately withhold closure. The paperback true crime shelf became a genre unto itself. Pinnacle Books, Zebra, St. Martin's True Crime line, and Signet churned out dozens of titles a year. Covers followed strict visual rules: black or blood red backgrounds, white or yellow type in distressed fonts, a central photograph, either killer mug shot or victim portrait, taglines such as "The True Story of" or "He Killed for Pleasure." Inside, chapters were short, paragraphs punchy, quotations italicized for drama. Sales were staggering, some titles reached 500,000 copies. Network television responded with made-for-TV movies and miniseries that sanitized the violence but preserved the emotional beats. Small Sacrifices, 1989, about Diane Downs. Blind Faith, 1989. A Killing in a Small Town, 1990. Candy Montgomery Axe Murder. Each used the same structure. Establish the victim's lickability and normalcy. Introduce the disruption. Build to the crime. Resolve or not with trial footage. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, the genre had become self-referential. Shows like Unsolved Mysteries, 1987-2002, and America's Most Wanted, 1988-2012, turned real cases into weekly dramatic segments, complete with Robert Stack's sepulchral narration, actors reenacting attacks, and 1-800-tip lines. The format owed as much to the 1841 pamphlets as to modern television. Present the mystery, show the victim's face, invite the audience to participate in solving it. As we now cross the threshold into the late 1990s and early 2000s, the precise moment when the once dominant broadcast and paperback monopoly on true crime storytelling began to fracture under the weight of the internet, Court TV's courtroom marathons, the first generation of amateur online sleuths, and the slow but accelerating arrival of DNA as both liberator and complicator. We resume exactly where the 1970s-1980s paperback and miniseries era deposited us, at the point where the genre had become so codified that audiences could predict its beats, yet so hungry for fresh mysteries that any new case arriving with the right ingredients, youthful female victim, photogenic portrait, lingering questions, photogenic crime scene, could still ignite national obsession almost overnight. Court TV, launched 1991, rebranded True TV in 2008, was the first major accelerator of fragmentation. Unlike the nightly news summaries or the one-off miniseries, Court TV offered wall-to-wall live coverage of high-profile trials, turning legal proceedings into serialized drama. The channel's breakthrough moment came with the 1994-1995 O.J. Simpson criminal trial, but its true crime identity solidified in the years that followed. By 1997-2000, Court TV had become the default destination for any case that combined murder, celebrity adjacency, and unresolved tension. The network did not invent the beautiful victim motif, but it perfected its television grammar. Soft focus victim photos looped during commercial breaks, side-by-side comparisons of then smiling prom picture, and now chalk outline or body bag on a gurney, slow-motion replays of 911 calls or surveillance footage, and anchors speaking in the hushed, confiding tone of someone sharing a terrible secret at a wake. The John Bennett Ramsey case, December 26, 1996, arrived at exactly the right cultural moment to exploit and be exploited by this new ecosystem. 6-year-old John Bennett Patricia Ramsey was found bludgeoned and strangled in the basement of her Boulder, Colorado home on the day after Christmas. She had been a child beauty pageant competitor. Within hours of the body's discovery, local affiliates obtained footage and stills from her pageant performances. Tiara, sequined costumes, heavy makeup accentuating enormous blue eyes, practiced smiles for judges. Those images became the visual cornerstone of the story. CNN, MSNBC newly launched, and Court TV ran them in heavy rotation, often accompanied by voice-over narration that described her as America's little princess or a child star taken too soon. The contrast was immediate and devastating, sparkle and innocence above ground, horror below. Print media followed the familiar script but with unprecedented speed and volume. The tabloids National Enquirer, Globe, Star published weekly specials with headlines that escalated weekly. John Bennett's secret diary, burglar theory crumbles, parents under the microscope. Mainstream outlets were more restrained but no less fixated. New York Times, Washington Post, and Time magazine ran multi-part series examining child pageants as a possible contributing factor, reviving the old moral panic thread that had once attached itself to Mary Rogers's job behind the cigar counter. The implication was the same. Placing a female, even a very young one, on public display invites danger. What made John Bennett different, and what marked the arrival of the digital fracture, was the Internet's rapid entry into the conversation. In 1996-1997, the World Wide Web was still young, but message boards, Usenet groups, alt-true crime, alt-conspiracy, and the first generation of personal homepages sprang up almost immediately. Fans and amateur investigators created sites such as Justice for John Bennett and the Ramsey Case Files, uploading scanned newspaper clippings, timeline spreadsheets, theories about pineapple in the stomach contents, the garrote knot, the ransom notes handwriting. Forums allowed real-time debate. Was it an intruder, an accidental death covered up by parents, a pedophile ring? The old top-down media gatekeepers suddenly had competition from thousands of unpaid researchers who could cross-reference details faster than any newsroom. This interactivity changed the emotional rhythm. Viewers no longer simply consumed, they participated. They posted grainy JPEGs of crime scene photos leaked from police files, argued over whether a high-tech boot print matched John Ramsey's shoes, dissected the 911 call for size that might indicate staging. The case became the first major true crime mystery to live as long online as it did offline. Even after the Boulder DA announced in 2008 that new DNA evidence touched DNA on John Bennett's clothing, excluded the Ramsey family, and pointed toward an unknown male intruder, online communities refused to accept closure. Subreddits, web sleuths threads, and YouTube deep dive channels kept relitigating every detail well into the 2020s. The early 2000s podcast precursors, internet radio shows, MP3 files shared on file-sharing networks picked up where forums left off. By 2004-2005, shows such as The High Strange and Crime Library Audio were experimenting with long-form narration of cold cases, often using John Bennett as a flagship episode. These proto-podcasts lacked the polished production of later hits but already displayed the genre's emerging conventions: dramatic reading of primary documents, the ransom note, police reports, ambient sound effects, creaking doors, distant sirens, interviews with retired detectives or journalists who had covered the case in real time. Court TV itself began to feel the pressure of this bottom-up competition. In 2005, the channel launched Forensic Files, a half-hour anthology series that distilled the forensic procedure formula into repeatable segments. Each episode followed the same arc: introduce the victim, usually a young woman, often photographed in life with bright lighting, describe the crime scene, walk through the investigation's missteps, highlight a breakthrough piece of trace evidence, hair, fiber, bite mark, later DNA, conclude with conviction or acquittal. The show's calm, clinical narration, Peter Thomas's unmistakable voice, contrasted sharply with the tabloid hysteria of the 1990s, yet it preserved the victim portrait opener and the lingering close-up on crime scene details. DNA itself became the great disruptor of the early 2000s. The Innocence Project, founded 1992, and the growing use of CODIS, Combined DNA Index System, expanded 1998, began producing high-profile exonerations that forced media to confront the possibility that some of the solved cases of previous decades might be wrong. The 2001 DNA exclusion of Albert DeSalvo from Mary Sullivan's Boston Strangler crime scene was an early tremor. The 2002 exoneration of several men in the Central Park 5 case, 1989, was a louder one. Television responded with specials titled When Evidence Lies or DNA, The New Truth Machine, but the genre's appetite for mystery often clashed with the new scientific certainty. Cases that had once been marketed as unsolved forever suddenly had endings, sometimes exonerating, sometimes confirming, that did not fit the dramatic arc audiences had come to expect, yet the most photogenic mysteries still commanded attention. The 2005 Natalie Holloway disappearance in Aruba became a textbook case of the old template meeting the new media environment. Holloway, an 18-year-old Alabama honors student on a high school graduation trip, vanished after leaving a nightclub with 3 local men. No body was ever found, but her senior portrait, blonde, smiling, wholesome, was everywhere. CNN, Fox News, Nancy Grace's nightly HLN show, the covers of People and Vanity Fair. Grace, in particular, turned the case into a 24/7 crusade, coining phrases, a young woman in danger, and hammering away at suspect Joran van der Sloot with prosecutorial zeal. Online forums exploded with theories: sex trafficking, accidental drowning, murder by a cover-up involving Aruban police. YouTube uploads of Holloway's pageant and school videos received millions of views. The case demonstrated that even without a body or a trial, the beautiful missing woman story could sustain years of coverage across every platform. Around the same time, the first true modern true crime podcasts began to appear. Criminal launched 2014, but with roots in earlier audio experiments, and Serial, 2014, arrived slightly later, but the groundwork was laid in the mid-2000s by shows like The Moth, Storytelling Nights, and This American Life episodes that occasionally dipped into crime. Serial Season 1, Adnan Syed, 1999 murder of Hae Min Lee, succeeded because it combined old ingredients, youthful victim photos, high school romance gone wrong, lingering doubt with new delivery, weekly episodes that invited listeners to email theories, a companion website with documents, Reddit megathreads that grew to hundreds of thousands of comments. The podcast format allowed long-form immersion impossible on television. Listeners could pause, rewind, discuss, and return. It also lowered the barrier to entry. No network approval needed, just a microphone and a compelling narrator. Pushback against the genre's excesses began to gain volume in the same period. Feminist critics, academics, and some journalists pointed out how relentlessly the camera lingered on female victims' appearance, how often speculation turned to she shouldn't have been there or she was asking for it, how rarely male victims received equivalent visual or narrative treatment. Books such as The Runaway Girl, about missing women, and articles in Bitch magazine and Jezebel critiqued the missing white woman syndrome that had propelled Natalie Holloway and Chandra Levy 2001 into the headlines, while similar cases involving women of color received scant attention. Social media amplified these critiques. Hashtags like Say Her Name, starting 2014 but building on earlier activism, pushed back against the selective memorialization of certain victims. Yet the machinery proved adaptable. Producers began to foreground victim advocacy, family interviews, and survivor voices. Shows like Up and Vanished, 2016 onward, and The Vanished Podcast, 2016, focused on missing persons cases, often emphasizing the personhood of the disappeared rather than their photogenic qualities. Documentaries such as The Jinx, 2015, and Making a Murderer, 2015, shifted attention towards systemic failures and unreliable narrators. Robert Durst, The Manitowoc County Justice System, diluting, but never eliminating, the beautiful victim hook. By the mid-2010s, the ecosystem had fully fragmented. Legacy television still ran marathons, podcasts dominated long-form storytelling, YouTube hosted amateur investigations with tens of millions of subscribers, Reddit and web sleuths maintained sprawling case files, TikTok began producing bite-sized recaps with dramatic music and text overlays. A single case could now live simultaneously on every platform, each version tailored to the medium's tempo and audience. We will bring the arc full circle, returning to the enduring presence of Mary Rogers herself in the 21st century true crime landscape. How podcasts, documentaries, academic monographs, Reddit threads, and even AI-assisted cold case solvers continue to revisit 1841, how the original mystery has become a meta-commentary on the genre it helped birth, and why after nearly 2 centuries, the questions she left behind still feel urgent. The river has carried us far, but it flows back to Hoboken. We conclude next. As we bring this long river journey full circle, returning at last to the sweltering July afternoon in 1841, where a young woman named Mary Cecilia Rogers stepped out of a Nassau Street boarding house, parasol in hand, never to return. We arrive precisely where the story has always insisted on lingering, in the persistent, almost defiant presence of her mystery within the 21st century true crime landscape. Nearly 2 centuries after her body was pulled from the Hudson near Sybil's cave, Mary Rogers refuses to become mere historical footnote. Instead, she has become something far more durable, a meta-commentary on the very genre she helped birth, a touchstone that every new platform, every new format, every new generation of storytellers returns to when they want to remember how fascination with female death, unresolved violence, and public spectacle first became mass entertainment in a democratic society. The digital age did not invent the obsession, it simply gave it infinite mirrors. Podcasts, now the dominant long-form medium, routinely circle back to 1841 as both origin story and cautionary tale. The mystery of Mary Rogêt is frequently cited in true crime episodes as the moment detective fiction learned it could feed on real corpses. Shows like Case File, Morbid, Crime Junkie, and My Favorite Murder have all devoted full episodes or multi-part series to Mary Rogers, often framing her as the case that inspired Poe, the original true crime media circus, or the beautiful victim who launched 1,000 headlines. Narrators read from digitized scans of the New York Herald, imitate James Gordon Bennett's breathless prose, play ambient river sounds under descriptions of the Hoboken thicket. Guest historians or Poe scholars appear to explain ratiocination, abortion laws in the 1840s, or the limits of early forensics. Yet even the most careful episodes cannot resist the pull of the archetype. The thumbnail almost always features a vintage illustration of a pale young woman in a white dress floating in dark water, raven hair fanned out, eyes closed in tragic repose. YouTube has turned the case into an even more visual echo chamber. Channels with names like Disturbin, Explore With Us, Alina Neal, Kendall Ray, and That Chapter produce hour-long deep dives, often scripted around the same beats. Slow zoom on a recreated 1840s New York street scene, sepia-toned stock footage of horse-drawn carriages, voiceover reciting witness statements, dramatic pauses when the abortion theory is introduced, side-by-side comparisons of Poe's fictional Mary Rogêt and the real Mary Rogers. Many videos include animated reconstructions, simple 2D or 3D models showing Mary walking to the ferry, meeting the shadowy companion, disappearing into a thicket, set to tense piano scores that swell at the moment of presumed violence. Comment sections beneath these videos are miniature archives of 21st century speculation. Users debating whether Frederica lied to protect her sons, whether Daniel Payne's suicide note was genuine remorse or misdirection, whether John Anderson's cigar shop profits spiked suspiciously after the murder. Threads regularly spiral into tangents about modern parallels. This is basically the 1840s version of Gabby Petito. Same vibes as the Delphi Girls, Pretty Girl Vanishes, Media Goes Wild, No Answers. Reddit has given the case its own permanent digital catacombs. The subreddit r/Unresolved Mysteries maintains a pinned master thread on Mary Rogers that has accumulated thousands of comments since 2014. Users post links to digitized newspapers from chronicling America, share Google Maps overlays of 1840s Hoboken versus today, argue over whether the swarthy man description was coded racism or genuine observation. Some threads attempt amateur profiling. If this happened today, would the killer be caught with CCTV and DNA? Others compile lists of cases that echo Mary Rogers, linking to Black Dahlia, John Bennett, Maura Murray, and the Long Island serial killer victims. The subreddit search function reveals a steady drip of new posts even in 2025-2026. Someone asking about the latest academic paper on abortion history, another sharing a TikTok reenactment, a third wondering if AI facial reconstruction from descriptions could produce a true likeness of Mary. TikTok and Instagram Reels have distilled the story into vertical, bite-sized tragedy. 30 to 90-second videos use trending audio, often melancholic piano or slowed-down heartbreak songs over text overlays. In 1841, a beautiful cigar girl vanished. Her body was found strangled near Sybil's cave. Poe wrote a story about it. The killer was never caught. These clips rack up millions of views because they compress the entire saga, beauty, mystery, media frenzy, no resolution, into a format optimized for endless scrolling. Duets and stitches allow users to react in real time, wide-eyed shock at the abortion angle, angry rants about how women are still blamed for their own murders, speculative theories delivered straight to camera. Academic interest has not waned either. Since Amy Gilman Esrubnik's 1995 book, The Mysterious Death of Mary Rogers, scholarly attention has only deepened. Recent monographs and journal articles place the case within histories of reproductive justice, urban studies, print culture, and gender violence. A 2022 article in the Journal of Women's History revisited Frederica Loss's affidavit through the lens of women's economic survival in antebellum America, arguing that Loss's shifting story may have been less about covering murder and more about protecting her precarious livelihood. A 2024 conference paper at the American Historical Association used digital mapping to recreate Mary's likely path from Nassau Street to Hoboken, concluding that the timeline left almost no room for the elaborate gang rape scenario some 1840s papers sensationalized. These works rarely make headlines, but they feed back into popular content. Podcasters cite them, YouTubers link them in descriptions, Redditors quote them in debates. Even artificial intelligence has begun to circle the case. In 2025-2026, several true crime channels experimented with AI-generated what-if reconstructions, feeding surviving descriptions of Mary, raven hair, dark expressive eyes, fair complexion, into image generation models to produce modern-style portraits or animated sequences of her final day. Others have prompted large language models to solve the mystery based on digitized primary sources, producing speculative conclusions that range from plausible botched abortion at Nick Moore's house to fanciful secret involvement of a political figure. These experiments are treated half as entertainment, half as serious cold case tools, yet they inevitably circle back to the same impasse that frustrated 1841 investigators: absence of definitive physical evidence, contradictory witness accounts, motives that dissolve under scrutiny. Why does Mary Rogers endure when so many other 19th century murders have faded? Because she is the perfect blank canvas for projection. She can be the victim of random urban violence, the casualty of unsafe abortion in a pre-Roe world, the target of a jealous lover, the collateral damage of media sensationalism itself. Each era finds in her story a reflection of its own fears. The 1840s feared immigrant strangers and female independence. The 1950s feared hidden deviance. The 1990s feared dysfunctional families. The 2020s fear algorithmic amplification of grief and the erosion of privacy even in death. She is unsolved, therefore endlessly solvable. She is beautiful or was made so by the press, therefore endlessly watchable. She died young and publicly, therefore endlessly mournable, and so the river keeps flowing. Sybil's cave is now part of a state park, its entrance gated, its springs still bubbling up through iron-rich rock. Tourists occasionally ask park rangers where the beautiful Cigar Girl was found. The rangers point vaguely toward the shoreline and recite the briefest version of the tale. Somewhere beneath the silt and time, fragments of that July day remain, perhaps a ribbon, perhaps a button, perhaps nothing at all. The questions drift on the current, carried from one century to the next, never quite sinking. That brings us to the end of this 10-part exploration of one of history's most haunting and influential unsolved murders. From the gaslit streets of 1841 New York to the glowing screens of 2026, the story of Mary Rogers has never really ended. It has only changed costumes, platforms, and narrators. If you've made it this far, thank you. These 10 parts have taken us through nearly 100,000 words of history, mystery, media, and memory. If you found value in this deep dive, please consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss future long-form explorations of history's strangest corners. Drop a comment below and let me know, where are you watching this from right now? What time is it where you are? Which part of the Mary Rogers story hit you the hardest? The media frenzy of 1841, Poe's fictional sleuthing, the abortion theory twist, or the way the case still echoes in today's true crime world? Your thoughts, theories, and locations help keep this conversation alive. Hit that like button if the journey was worth it. Share this series with anyone who loves unsolved history, and I'll see you in the next deep dive. Until then, stay curious, stay safe, and remember, some stories refuse to stay buried.